What's up, guys? Jared here again to, surprise, gush about the newest episode of South Park. This is probably the most profound piece of American media to address the issues surrounding the pandemic and the pandemic response without even mentioning the pandemic in the episode. And I really think that this cements Trey as the most insightful American satirist of our time. And if there's even the smallest chance that Trey is watching this right now, please read my original South Park episode script, link in the description. Anyway, let's start off with a summary of this episode before breaking it down, because there's a lot to say. So due to a misunderstanding, PC Principal ends up punishing Mr. Garrison's class by canceling Pajama Day. After that, the issue of abolishing Pajama Day becomes hyper-politicized, and people draw strict ideological lines. Everybody is wearing pajamas at work to criticize PC Principal's tyrannical exercise of authority, and people are required to wear pajamas in public spaces. Others are refusing to wear pajamas even during bedtime to show their position that the social pressure to do so is tyrannical. All the while, everyone in town is likening the events going on to Nazi Germany, and that's actually probably the funniest part of the episode. Despite the fact that the children explain that they didn't do anything wrong and that this whole thing was just based on a misunderstanding, PC Principal has to uphold his decision to maintain order and also as to not appear weak, even though he realizes that he's wrong. It's only at the end, when Wendy reminds PC Principal that Opposite Day is coming up, that PC Principal decides he can blame Mr. Mackey for getting the school holidays wrong and uses Opposite Day as an excuse to reverse his misguided decision and allow the kids to wear pajamas. Alright, so let's dive in. What does Pajama Day represent, and who does PC Principal represent? So on one level, this whole thing about people getting up in arms about pajamas, people wearing pajamas in the streets, people singing about how great it is to wear pajamas. On one level, this is talking about how people will draw ideological lines over the dumbest things. Today, people will latch on to the most absurd things in order to form a tribe and label it the morally correct one. In the episode, people even get divisive about whether pajamas should be called cozy wozy or comfy wumpy. And then people will be likened to Nazis over the smallest assertions of authority. This is something that happens all the time in our society now, especially if you're on Twitter. In the episode, even eventually the assertion that we should stop making Matt Damon jokes is suggested to be a Nazi-like exercise of authority. On another level, as you can probably guess from the way that I summarized the episode, there's a clear gesture toward Pajama Day representing mask mandates and other COVID precautionary measures. So in one scene, there's a citizen who laments how silly it is that he has to wear pajamas as he enters a restaurant because that's the rules of the restaurant, but he can take them off as soon as he sits down at his table and starts eating. So you can see how that silliness is very much reflected in our own day-to-day silliness where, we have to wear masks to get into restaurants, but once we're in the restaurant and sitting down and eating, we can take it off and consume and spend money. In another scene, there are professionals in a realtor office that say that everyone in the office is wearing pajamas because it is a source of pride. It shows that they care about other people. Now, of course, when a coworker comes in without pajamas because he just didn't feel like wearing them, they immediately cast him out and label him as a redneck gun-toting POS, which reflects on how wearing a mask is sometimes not so much about safety, so much as it is an opportunity to prove one's moral superiority. Then there's another scene where a man gets too self-righteous about his decision not to wear pajamas, even though it's bedtime, showing that oftentimes anti-maskers can be a huge pain in the ass, and they reject authority just to get high on their own self-righteousness, not unlike the people I just described in the office. There's also a Pajama Time song where people from all walks of life are celebrating and flaunting their pajamas, celebrating pajamas because it makes them feel good. Now, what's interesting about this episode is that you can't quite say that wearing pajamas equals wearing a mask on the subtextual level, because In the episode, people are asked to wear pajamas to undermine authority, not to reinforce it, whereas most people would say that if you are wearing a mask, you are supporting the authority of the CDC, of Fauci, of whatever, or depending on where you are in the world, whereas you are kind of undermining authority if you decide not to wear a mask. And that's one of the brilliant things about this, is that the episode is deliberately messy to avoid a clear one-to-one allegory of either anti-mask sentiment or its opposite. I think that this episode is constructed to get the audience to project their own biases onto Pajama Day and PC Principle. In fact, one of the greatest things about this is that the comparison to Nazi Germany that's happening all throughout the episode, which is so funny, is leveled at both the pajama mandates and Pajama Day abolishment. So at the end of the day, if you were to ask yourself, who is PC Principle, I think that there's ample evidence to suggest that he's Fauci or the CDC or CNN or Biden or Trudeau or the Washington Post, these pro-lockdown sources of authority of information. But I think that there's also evidence to suggest that he could be Joe Rogan or Vax skeptics, etc. And I think that's one of the brilliant things about this episode. And I know that a lot of people are very critical about this notion of both-siderism, but I think that, well, I mean, if you've been watching this channel, you know that I'm very much in favor of healing the divide rather than, whatever it means to quote-unquote win this culture war. But, you can very easily liken this to the studies that are coming out that are suggesting that lockdowns may not have been efficient at all or really made any difference, and that people like PC Principle are, the Biden administration or CNN or Fauci that won't just admit that they were wrong. But you can just as easily point to evidence that PC Principle represents somebody like Joe Rogan, who may have used the wrong information to talk about the chances of myocarditis with the vaccine and is not necessarily jumping out of his seat to prove that he was wrong, although he definitely admits he's wrong more than, CNN. So what's the overall message of the episode? And I think we see something here that's quite unique among media. It's a take that I haven't seen. And I think the take is that so often we attribute malevolence to power, when oftentimes it's just a mistake. Toward the end of the episode, we see PC Principle crying about the weight of responsibility that comes with being in charge to make the right decision. Now, the problem with this is that this idea that people in power that make mistakes or make the wrong decision are doing it in service of some kind of nefarious agenda is a competence fantasy. Because more often than not, people are just doing the best with what they have. And in the case of a pandemic, where people need immediate guidance when science takes time, it's too easy to assume that these mistakes were made in service of a nefarious agenda, rather than just regular human incompetence. And so when we see the newscaster in the episode, as well as other people of South Park, constantly invoking Nazi Germany, it reminds us that, yeah, we're all quick to assume that the people making these wrong decisions are doing so out of some great, meticulously calculated effort that is extremely competently organized in order to keep us all subjected, or to keep us all in metaphorical chains. But oftentimes these people are just making human mistakes. And the reason why I find this so refreshing is because in a time when discourse on both the left and the right is constantly equating power with evil, it's nice to see a humane, sympathetic portrayal of power. Now, the tragedy of this episode that's very well illustrated here is that people get in too deep. People in power do not take personal responsibility for their mistakes. And this is another interesting development, because personal responsibility has always been something that South Park has talked about. And usually it's about how, in the face of all of these different power structures or institutions that people are looking to scapegoat for their problems, South Park is always saying, no, we should take personal responsibility. But the interesting thing here is that South Park is looking at the leaders of these institutions and saying that they are not taking responsibility for their mistakes or even recognizing their mistakes as mistakes. And the reason why is because, well, one, of cowardice, because we see in the episode that PC Principal tells Wendy that I can't possibly get myself out of this, it's now your problem, but also that the perceived cost is too high. People will lose their livelihood, their community, and even their identity. So, in order for someone in power to actually admit that they were wrong, they need a scapegoat, which PC Principal chooses to be Mr. Mackey and the whole opposite day thing. The episode is actually quite smart about painting the people criticizing PC Principal as belligerent, because again, this goes back to the Nazi thing. Everyone's a Nazi. Because another thing that keeps these people in power from correcting their mistakes is because it will validate the belligerent methods of criticizing them. And to them, in their view, that is also irresponsible. Now, this conclusion is classic South Park cynicism. We all have our heads so deep inside our asses and we have no way of digging ourselves out. And I guess that this is just a result from our panoptic state of living, where people have to be very overzealous and performative and discipline themselves in a way that protects them from criticism. And, you can't be seen to respond to these belligerent criticisms despite whether they are right or wrong. Now, this whole thing about not taking responsibility for your mistakes and just continuing to double down is not just something that we see in authority figures, but something that we see in normal everyday people, as the episode also illustrates. And this doesn't only go to the pandemic, although we can definitely very easily paint a picture where somebody claims that, for example, lockdowns are necessary or that the vaccine actually limits the spread of COVID, and they just won't admit the mistakes when contrary science comes out. But there's other things too, like, for example, maybe you got caught up in the emotional hurricane following George Floyd's death, and no one can blame you, because that video was horrifying and it was a horrible thing, and we should get emotional about it. But maybe due to that, you started thinking that someone like Robin DiAngelo has a point, and you start believing in all this white fragility nonsense. And from there, your position in your community, whether it be a professional community or a social community, is built on a foundation of a moral position that is formed in contrast of the other community, of the wrong community. And if later you come to find yourself in a more tempered, calm state of mind and realize that some of the things you said or believed may have been misguided, if you admit that you're wrong, you compromise your place within this community. You can even compromise your viability as an employee in your professional life, or your social position in your friend group, and ultimately, your very identity. A very strong line is drawn, and the individual has so much to lose if this line is transgressed, and as a result, people will just keep doubling down on their mistakes. It's a very sad state of affairs, and really, the only thing I can really hope is that by creating more art like this, we can start to empower people to look at themselves critically and hopefully crawl out of their own assholes. So, this is an ending very much in the tradition of classic South Park cynicism. We see a similar thing in the season, 23 episode Dead Kids, where at the end, Sharon basically admits and basically goes to agree with the rest of the town in saying that, school shootings aren't a big deal. So, like other episodes, there isn't a lot of hope for humanity. And I think that maybe Trey does this because he thinks that's the best way to wake people up, is just by showing them how ugly things are right now, hoping that by showing them such a cynical perspective, it will encourage people to stop being like this, to wake up. So I just want to end this by saying that I really just appreciate this episode. I appreciate this sentiment, and I appreciate that this voice exists, because South Park is really the only show out of Hollywood that seems to be preoccupied with trying to heal the divide and not just diving headfirst into very strange political positions as a form of cynical clout chasing, to show that both sides have been acting like absolute clowns. So really, what I have to say about this is, Trey, please never stop, because We need your voice more than ever. That's it for me today. I want to remind you guys, please subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be breaking down more South Park episodes this season, so long as they continue to be as insightful as this one was. Another thing that I'm really excited to review in the upcoming weeks is Ben Shapiro's first movie, based his production company. Now, whether you love or hate Ben Shapiro, I think that's kind of immaterial, because I think this movie is a very interesting development in just the trajectory of cinema, or at least potentially it is, because movies are not exactly the sexiest investment these days, and it takes a lot of guts for Ben Shapiro to be investing money in this play. And for those people who think that there has been kind of one ideological sentiment that runs through all of the money and all the productions going through Hollywood, it is interesting to see somebody try to create an alternative. And I don't know if he'll be successful. The movie might be awful, but I think it's an interesting swing. And so I'm definitely going to be reviewing it when the movie comes out in like 2 weeks or something. Also, I'm going to be playing Elden Ring towards the end of the month, so that'll be interesting, because I've never done any kind of gaming play-along content. But anyway, that's it for me today, guys. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, peace.